All right, so today we're going to revisit the composition of functions. And if you recall from chapter 1, the composition of two functions is when we take the output of one function and feed it into the input of another function. So for example, if we take the output of g of x and we feed it into a function f, we end up with f of g of x. And that's said to be the composition of f with g. All right, so we're just taking the output of one function and feeding it into the input of another function. So let's take a look at the first example here. We're just going to practice writing some composition of functions. All right, so the first one is f of g of x. All right, so we're going to take the output of g of x and feed it into the input of f of x. All right, so f of x is e to the 3x. All right, the input is x, but we're gonna feed into it the g of x function. So x squared plus x. All right, and that's it. We're replacing the input of one function with the output of the other function. All right, so let's look at g of f of x. Now, g of x is x squared, right? But the input is x, so it's something squared plus something. All right, so in place of x, I'm going to write e to the 3x. E to the 3x. All right, now you could just leave it like that, or we could combine these. Exponents if we want, and write e to the 6x plus e to the 3x. All right, so that's a composition of g of x with f of x. Now we can also compose a function with itself. So we're just taking the output of the function and feeding it into its own input. All right. So, but again, it's similar. So the f of x is e to the 3x, but that x is the input. And in place of that input, I'm going to write f of x, right? Because we're feeding the output of f of x into the input of f of x. So we end up with an e to the 3x in the exponent. So that's kind of an ugly looking exponent. That whole thing, 3 times e to the 3x. I could write this as 3e to the 3x if I wanted to without the parentheses. I put the parentheses in there just to emphasize where the input is. All right, I'm replacing the input of x with the parentheses and then putting the new function in. So, but there you go. We've composed f of x with f of x. And we could do the same thing with g of x and g of x. We could compose g of x with g of x. So g of x is just the input squared, right, plus the input again. But this time I'm going to feed in g of x, which is x squared plus x, right? And I'm going to put it, I'm going to replace x everywhere, the input everywhere, with x squared plus x. Okay. Now I could expand that out and simplify, but I don't really have a reason to do that. So I'm just going to leave it that way. So anyway, there you go. There's example 1, and I'll meet you in the next video for example 2.